How's it going, PengPirates Crew? It's Adrian, and we're back with another video. So today we are going to be talking about Whitebeard. Sorry I haven't been uploading as much. I'm still in the process of moving, so videos aren't getting churned out as fast as I want them to. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about Whitebeard. It has had an amazing amount of placings, especially in top 16 recently. Even though certain cards in this deck got hit on the limited list, it doesn't seem to really have affected it at all. And doesn't surprise me too much because the red card pool is huge and there were so many different ways to play Whitebeard to begin with. And even with 9 cost being at 1, it's still not impossible to land on curve. And even without the 9 cost Whitebeard, you still have a lot of ways to win the game playing Whitebeard. I already made this video back when OP2 started, but the game has kind of changed a little bit. There's cards that were added. Also, the limited list changes a lot about the Whitebeard matchup. But yeah, let's just get right into it, starting with what this leader does. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We all pretty much know what the main draw of Whitebeard is. Him being a 6,000 power leader is insanely oppressive. He can swing you for high numbers, but also when you swing at him, you have to invest more Dawn or more bigger characters to swing at him. This of course comes with a drawback that he has to take his life every single turn. But of course, this isn't really too big of a drawback too, because he's also drawing more cards, and him being harder to swing at, it's just more difficult. The game changes a lot. A lot of the math changes. But yeah, that's the most important thing. He's a 6,000 power leader. That's really all that we care about. So before getting into some general strategies to play against this deck, let's talk briefly about what makes this deck so strong so we could better understand how to beat it. Already mentioned this before, but just being at 6,000 power is insanely oppressive. It just changes a lot of the math throughout the game, and it gives the Whitebeard player so much value throughout it. And that's why on the receiving end, we have to be so methodical with how we play. Every single swing has to be meaningful. It has to do something. You have to have an objective with it, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to how many cards that Whitebeard player has in hand when you're going for game and how much math that they have. Another huge upside to playing Whitebeard is that you have a really simple game plan. And this is really important because if you play a deck like Law, you could oftentimes lose to yourself, if that makes any sense. 1 or 2 wrong decisions, 1 or 2 wrong searches, and the game is pretty much over. With Whitebeard, the turns are very linear and your line of play is pretty linear as well. Over the course of the turn, Whitebeard players are really just going to be playing characters every single turn and then swinging for as big of a number as they can while leaving a couple Dawn up for counter events if they need to. And then they will just keep doing that, keep swinging at your face with big numbers until you die. This makes it more difficult for us playing against the Whitebeard player because the only thing that they need to worry about is upkeeping their board and swinging at your face and applying pressure. A lot of the time, because they're at this 6,000 power or higher, especially for their characters, other decks need removal options like lowering their power, bouncing them, popping them to even deal with the things on board. And with cards like Ace, it makes it even more difficult to take the board in the late game where you really need those power swings. And none of the things that I listed out are difficult to pull off. You could even run the event cards like Whitebeard Pirates, and because, it's a Whitebeard Pirates card as well as an event, it works for both Marcos. And this leads to some insane pressure because the Whitebeard player is playing down so many big bodies, they're swinging at you for high numbers, and on top of that, they have this monstrous hand that you somehow have to deal with throughout the game. But yeah, those are the main strengths that we kind of have to play around. It seems very difficult and very impossible to deal with, but I promise you, you will get better at it in time. A lot of the Whitebeard matchup just really is about not making any mistakes and making sure you're very methodical in how you play. So to get a better idea of how we can be more methodical with our play, why don't we talk about the characters that we need to look out for in this deck? Alright, so starting it off, of course, they run big vanillas. They run things like Frankie, Speed Jill, Atmos, King Do, Thatch. Everything is at 6,000 power, so no matter what you're swinging at, they're going to be able to protect it comfortably. And this makes it even simpler for them because they don't have to think about, should I protect my board here or should I save these cards to protect my life? They usually always want to protect their board because they want to keep getting value out of these big swings. We could, of course, use this to our advantage. Decks that are going to be high in removal are really good against Whitebeard because if Whitebeard can't establish that threatening board and, keep swinging turn for turn, it's going to be very difficult for them to race you down. And if you end up having a wider board than them, oftentimes Whitebeard players will lose a lot of cards out of their hand protecting it, or they will just lose their board altogether. So, be wary of these big vanillas. If there's a 6k on board, you usually just want to swing into it. The 7ks and the 8ks, it's going to be a little bit harder of an ask to swing into it, honestly. And I usually would not advise you do it unless you have something like, a minus 2,000 power, minus 3,000 power, or just straight up removal. All right, so the next cards that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be, kind of focusing on one by one, starting with Rush Luffy. This is a card that you should be expecting them to play on 5. A lot of the Whitebeard matchups, like, they could really catch you off guard, especially if you block out of a 6k and, all of a sudden they have another 6k swing with this Rush Luffy. I have definitely been caught off guard a lot by this card, especially when I'm protecting board. Maybe something isn't worth it, or maybe this is a 6k swing that you should be countering out of, but you countered out of like a 7k swing. There's just so many different scenarios where this card comes into play. Always be wary of it. When you're going through your turns, if there is a possibility that they can play the Luffy, always just kind of keep in mind, like, is that something that I can deal with? Is this something I should protect? Or if they play Luffy here, am I like totally boned? Another thing to be really wary of is going down to 0 life, even with blockers up against Whitebeard. A lot of the times people will kind of forget that this card exists, to be honest, especially if they've already removed it from the board. And I'm here to tell you, if you can help it, and especially if the Whitebeard player is like saving a bunch of Dawn, you want to be calculating how much Dawn a Luffy like full stack swing will hit you for, and do you have enough counter to block that? Because this is another scenario where you could actually like play a lot of mind games with the Whitebeard player, because if he goes all in for a Luffy, he won't have any cards up for events, and that's super important because maybe you kill him on the crackback, maybe you clear his board on the crackback, but just keeping this Luffy in mind is going to make games a lot easier. If this thing is on board, I would prioritize it. This is like a kill on sight card, because you don't want it to keep gaining value, especially if you're a deck that runs high blockers like green or blue. Let's talk about the other 5 costs in this deck, and this is going to be the new 5 cost SR Marco. This card is absolutely nuts. Whitebeard players can revive this card when it's knocked out just by pitching an event card. This does not work like blocker Marco. He could do this at any time. Also, it has the on-play effect. On your turn, you could KO a 3000 power or less character on the board. But what it really does well is KO low-cost blockers. This is why I think that you should really hold on to your cheap blockers, anything with, like 3000 power or less, until the end game. They're going to be much more useful, because let's say that you play like something like a Domino or like a Beige on curve, and this Marco comes out before you can block. That's a huge detriment to you, because in the end game, if they have to play this Marco to pop one of your blockers, that's 5 Dawn that they have to use for that. That's half of their Dawn. So it really restricts the plays and, how much Dawn they could swing with for. And then also, if they want to leave stuff up for counter events, that's a huge problem. I feel like because this card exists, you don't really want to ever play those blockers like early on, even if they're your only play. Especially against yellow, I've made this mistake quite a few times actually, where I would trigger a Brûlée because, it's a free trigger, but then it swings back over to the Whitebeard's turn, and on 5 Dawn he just plays a Marco, or on 6 Dawn he plays a Marco, and that Brûlée is effectively just gone. And it would have been better if I just saved it in my hand to, maybe counter 1k or just play straight up for 3 Dawn. When he is able to play it, be wary of what plays that you can do and what plays make sense. Searchers are usually always safe. Like, you could play a searcher out and you don't mind it being popped. It probably wasn't going to be doing anything anyway. But yeah, for things like blockers, the other searchers where you have to rest 1 Dawn, it's going to be a lot harder to play around this card, and you really do not want to play those cards too early. Also, when this card is rested, I wouldn't recommend swinging magic numbers like 8k into this thing. You want to be swinging 6k into it. And this is mainly because if you swing 8k into it, they could just get rid of like a Whitebeard Pirates event from their hand, or like, an event that they're not going to be using in the next coming turns. And that really sucks for you, because if it's something like Whitebeard Pirates, they just countered plus 3k essentially for free. So you really want to stick with just matching the power level of this Marco. Like, if you minus it, swing 4k at it. If you don't, just keep swinging 6k at it. It's something to swing other than the leader, so they don't get that many cards, and they actually have to give you cards to preserve this thing. All right, talking about the other rush card, we have 7 cost Ace. This card is absolutely nuts on curve. It is one of the cards that you have to absolutely always be thinking about in your head. I cannot tell you how many games I have won as Whitebeard playing this Ace, because my opponent just forgets that I can play this card, and they'll full swing out on their board, allowing me to just completely clear it. Because let's say that you have an Atmos or something on board with 6k, you have your leader with 6k, and then this Ace has rush. It gives 2 things minus 3000 power. There's absolutely no way that they're countering out of the board, and it really sucks when you're caught off guard with this card. And then also, I want you guys to be wary of it even off curve, because one of the strongest plays a Whitebeard player can do, especially now that they only have 1 9 cost, is, you know, on 9 or 10 Dawn, they just play this ace, they get an extra attacker on board, they swing into your board, and they have 2 Dawn left, 3 Dawn left for counter events. That is like an absolute nightmare scenario to deal with because you pretty much cannot swing at anything on their board. If you swing at their life and they want to protect, they're going to protect their life. And it's just a really, really bad time. So this is something that you always want to be thinking about. And the main way I play around this card is just when they're going to play on 7, that's usually when I'll swing tall instead of, you know, swing wide. I know it's really tempting when we have like 3 or 4 characters on board against Whitebeard to just kind of like use all of them to swing out. But if this is coming on their next turn, you really don't want to do that. Like maybe you swing very tall at something like an Atmos, like maybe you swing tall with your leader, maybe you swing tall with one character so they don't get too much value off of it. But most of the time before the ace turn, I'm not going to really be swinging out with my characters because that is just asking to lose the game and get your board wiped. So now we're going to be talking about the 9-cost Whitebeard, and after the restricted list, this card is a lot easier to deal with. Before, Whitebeard players could just chain this card back to back, which was a huge problem and not a lot of decks could really deal with it. But now only having to worry about one, if the Whitebeard player is playing for this card, they are not going to have a lot of cards in their hand in the late game. That's granted you're playing correctly, of course. So it might actually be very difficult for the Whitebeard player to even drop this, because since they can't back to back Whitebeard, the max life that they're going to be at after this thing is played is going to be 1. So the most important thing about playing around this card is just making sure that you are prepared for it, and you do this by playing more defensively than offensively. If you have to load up a bunch of Dawn to swing 8k at their leader, you really don't want to do that. It might be a better idea to swing tall with something like your leader, or even like a really big character if you can, and then saving your Dawn for counter events, saving them to play blockers, because their turn after they play this card is going to be the most important one in the game, because if they don't kill you in that turn, if they have low cards in hand, it's actually really, really unlikely that they'll be able to finish the game before you kill them. So making sure that you're able to preserve your board if they swing at it, or preserve your life if they're going for game, is really, really important. Also keep in mind, you could really, really telegraph what's in a Whitebeard player's hand and what plan they're going for by how they counter. If you swing 8k or even 10k at their leader and they're countering out of that early, you can already prepare for the 9 cost, because the only 2 reasons why they would be doing this is if 1, they're a bad Whitebeard player, or 2, they're playing for the 9 costs on curve. So it's really important that you pick up on things like that. But for the most part, this card is still as strong as it was in OP3, but it loses that back-to-back threat that made it so strong. When this card is played, you do not really want to be swinging at the leader unless you have big characters. You want to be saving your aggressive swings for the turn after, since they're going to be back at that 6,000 power. You really don't want to lose your board the turn after this is played, because that's basically checkmate. Also, as a side note, even if you play like a low cost blocker, it's still really important that you do this knowing it'll get popped, because you really don't want this to be the last big swing that they do at your leader. So now we're going to be going over some general strategies on how to win against Whitebeard. In general, what it's really going to come down to is how well do you deal with the aggression they're putting out, and how well can you get cards out of their hands so that you could go for lethal in the end game. So pretty much everything that we're going to be talking about is going to center around these 2 ideas. How can we stave off aggression, and then also how can we get cards out of their hand in a meaningful way. And one of the most important things to think about is, when do I swing board and when do I swing life? In my opinion, you should really only be swinging at the board if anything is at or lower than their leader power. So if they're at 6,000 power and they have like Arrested Atmos or Arrested Marco, I would definitely try swinging at their characters first, because it does both. Because it plays into the 2 things that are going to win us the game, right? One is saving off aggression. If we take that character off the board, it can't swing at us when it goes back to his turn. And also, if he's protecting it or trying to protect it, you're going to get cards out of the Whitebeard player's hands. And that doesn't always translate when you're swinging at their life, right? Because if you're swinging at their leader, if you're swinging 6k, they probably will counter out of that. But if you were to swing 8k into their lead, you might not get cards out of their hand, right? If anything, you might give them a card because they took that life. So in my opinion, just always be mindful of this. I would really only swing at the Whitebeard player's board when something is 6k. Even if you have like a big attacker like an 8k or like a 10k swing, it's usually better to swing into the leader, because swings like that at that stage of the game will take cards out of their hand. That changes, of course, if you are about to die like next turn and you need to take out the characters, but for the most part, swing at rested 6k characters, and then everything else you could really just swing at their leader to get cards out of their hand. And then also, on the topic of swings, make sure you're mapping out how many swings the Whitebeard player has, and also potentially how much he can hit you for. I can't tell you how many times I'm playing around the Whitebeard player playing like a specific card, and then he'll just like attach 2 or attach 3 and swing like 9k at me, where that's something I didn't really think about. So I'll just eat 2 damage within a turn, where that's really dangerous. And that's why we always have to plan out not only our turns, but potentially what the Whitebeard can play, right? Because against Whitebeard, you really have to make every life that you take very meaningful. Oftentimes, I can find myself taking a lot of life, especially in the early game, because I don't want to give them cards. But against Whitebeard, there's another layer to that, because they're eventually going to just grab a ton of huge bodies and swing at you. So sometimes it's really important that you counter out early, because later on, those swings are going to be way harder to counter out of, right? When he has multiple 6k bodies, an 8k body, and a 10k body. For my next point, you really want to use your blockers meaningfully. I see a lot of players sometimes, like just because it's an on-curve play that they can do, they'll play something like a blocker on their first turn if they're going second. And I think this is a huge misplay. When you have blockers in hand, you should have an idea of what you want to protect with it. Blockers are very annoying to Whitebeard players, especially if they're above that 3k power. So they're really essential in protecting your characters and then also throwing off lethal. The only blockers that I would accept you playing on curve is stuff like Fukuro and Borsellino, where they can't be popped, and then also stuff like Queen and Trafalgar Law, where they're at that 6k, so if they swing 7k at you, you could just block and then give them a 2k. But other than that, you really want to save those blockers for key moments and not just for plays on curve, because it might be even more productive to just not play the blocker at all and then full stack and swing into their leader. Also, for my last point, this is something that every deck can do because every deck has some sort of removal, but similar to how you use blockers, you really want to save removal for these meaningful moments. The way I like to think about it against Whitebeard is you want to use removal when you're swinging momentum in your favor. For example, let's say on 4 they play something like an Atmos. If I'm playing a deck like Red and I have 5 Dawn, if I have a play that I can commit to board, I really don't want to use 4 Dawn to play like a Jet Pistol right away and swing 6, because then I'm not developing anything on my board. And what ends up happening is on their turn, now they could play something like a Thatch, and then now what do I do? Because there's this sort of like seesaw effect of us going back and forth developing things on board. Yeah, sure, it might be good that I removed the Atmos, but it didn't swing momentum in my favor in any way, right? Now a situation where this would swing momentum in my way is, let's say that he needs to go for lethal within the next turn, and now I have this Jet Pistol to use to take out one of his attackers. That is what I mean by just thinking about removal in that different way. You don't want to just like remove everything in sight. Of course, this gets a lot easier to talk about when we have characters that have removal like Sakazuki and Mihawk, because you're getting a body as well as removing something on the board. But just think about it more in that way. It's all about that momentum in the game. And then also just a side note, even if you don't have a certain removal card, you want to bluff like you do. And what I mean by this is, let's say that you're playing black and they have something like Arrested Atmos on board. Even if I don't have a Sakazuki in hand, I really want to put away 6 Dawn so that I can threaten me playing it. And then what that ends up doing is, if I could swing 6k into this Atmos, now the Whitebeard player has to think, do I potentially want to give multiple cards out of my hand if this thing is going to get popped anyway? Or should I just let it go off of the first swing that he does, because he's going to play something like a Sakazuki and get it removed from the board? If you have the correct board and the correct threats to do this, sometimes it's even better than having the actual removal card itself, right? Because they might immediately let that character go, and then now you could play around with whatever Dawn that you were bluffing with and do different plays that they expected. So there is that sort of like poker side of One Piece where you have to bluff, and honestly, anything that's going to get the Whitebeard player to think more is going to work very well in your favor. So now we're going to be getting into the more specific things that you can do if you're playing a specific color or a specific deck, starting off with what you can do as Red playing Zoro or Luffy. So first off, just a reminder, if you're playing things like Fire Fist and Jet Pistol, you really want to keep that momentum thing in mind, especially for Fire Fist. Because if you Fire Fist in a time that's not meaningful, or it doesn't swing a bunch of momentum in your favor, what can end up happening is you gave up multiple cards to pull off this Fire Fist, and in the mid to late game, you might not have the gas to finish or even keep up with the Whitebeard player because you did that. Ideally, with Zoro, you want to prioritize your bigger cards. You don't really want to play this like you normally do with every other deck, where you're just like creating a wide board with your smaller cards. You really want to prioritize your 5 and 6k bodies. Also, you really want to create a wide board that your opponent just can't ignore, and you're going to do this by not immediately swinging with all the characters on your board, and instead swinging with your leader first and Tall. And you do this because if you're only resting 1 or 2 characters at a time, it's really easy for that Whitebeard player to deal with that board because everything is going to be 6k and above for him, so it's going to be harder for you to counter out. So what you want to do is you want to develop something on the board, and then with the remaining Dawn you have, just put it onto your leader and swing into his face. And eventually, because Whitebeard plays low removal, you're going to have a board with 4 or 5 characters, and if you turn them all sideways to swing at the Whitebeard player, now you've created a situation where they have to swing at multiple characters, especially if you have stuff like events up, because if they swing at your life, they might not live for the next turn. And I see that with a lot of players where they will not turn even a Rush Zoro sideways because they're waiting for that moment when they have like 3 or 4 characters on board, so they could just all turn them sideways all at once, and it's much more difficult to deal with something like that, especially if you have like 5-cost Marcos on the board. So for green, because it's a very like fundamentals heavy deck, it's relatively the same game plan as red, where you want to just like develop and then swing with the remaining Dawn. But green runs into this problem where they don't really have access to a lot of removal cards. That's why green has trouble sometimes, especially Kinemon had trouble in OP2 against Whitebeard, because there's a lack of removal. Because Whitebeard is better at controlling the board, since they have more counter and more just straight up power than you do, it's very difficult to take the board away from Whitebeard. And then that kind of goes into my next point, where sometimes when you're playing Kid, it's just sometimes better to double swing with big numbers than to develop something on board. And this is because if you take the time to develop something and you actually try to fight for board, most of the time you're going to end up losing because they have so many counters in hand, and also they have more powerful characters than you do, so you're going to eventually lose your board or lose every card in your hand. So sometimes it's just better to, you know, like attach 3, swing 8k twice, swing 10k twice, because that puts a lot of pressure on the Whitebeard player. And you especially want to do this when they didn't leave Dawn up for events, because it's just going to eat away cards at their hand, and if you keep doing this turn after turn, they're going to be taking a lot of life. And then also my last point is sometimes like it takes multiple or a couple turns to kill a Whitebeard player, so you don't really have to rush it, especially with green where you have so many blockers. You might be running the 8 cost. Don't rush those lethals. I've lost so many games on Kinemon because I didn't take the turn or 2 to actually just try and survive. So blue actually has a pretty good matchup into Whitebeard, especially if you're playing Dofi. The main things that I would look for is be careful during the ace turn. You could lose your entire board during these turns. As a Whitebeard player, Dofi was a very hard matchup for me, but the games that I would win almost always were because they went, you know, like just mindlessly swung 6k at me, even though I had the ace available. And then when I played ace down, it just let me full swing into their board and they lost it. And then from there, it's just too much tempo to regain the game. Also, especially if you're playing Dofi, you really want to pressure the board and make the Whitebeard player chase after your board. Playing a deck like Dofi is really cool because you get to develop your own board while swinging at theirs. It's why Dofi has such a good time against Whitebeard, especially Strawbeard. Swinging 8k into like a 6k body feels really nice, and then also you usually get like a 5k body out of that. So what ends up happening is a lot of Whitebeard players could just get into this cycle where you're swinging into their stuff, they're countering out, losing cards out of their hand, and then they have to swing into your board because it's just getting wider and wider. Also, another tip, for some reason I see this a lot with blue players, don't hold on to removal for like the perfect target. If you have a really good removal option and it's going to swing, again, momentum in your favor, you want to use it, right? You don't have to save that 3000 world specifically for Marco. Using it on something like an Atmos or like a Kingdu is just as good, obviously. I've even seen some players like save the 9-cost Mihawk for some reason to use it specifically against Ace. And things like that, you don't have to match up the max amount that they could bounce or bottom deck with the cost, right? As long as it's getting you a lot of tempo, playing that removal is going to really help you in the long run. All right, so for black, you're really going to want to telegraph removal even if you don't have it. That's something I kind of touched upon earlier, but if you have enough Dawn, like put away 6 Dawn for like a Sakazuki just to get them scared, because you might get free removal without even having to use the removal. And of course, the essential part of black game plan, I feel like, get down the Borsalino. You mainly want to do this because it's going to be easier to counter out of the last swing that they do in a turn. It could really save you a lot of cards throughout the game. And on top of that, you don't really have to worry about things like Fire Fist or Jet Pistol Trigger. Some Whitebeard players will be running that, but most of them will not be. But yeah, it's just to stave off aggression. It's really good for that, and it's really going to help you in the late game. The next one is also very specific. Save Shockwave for blockers if you can. There's not a lot of targets to hit with Shockwave, And of course, leave it up if you have to, but in my opinion, dealing with a Whitebeard blocker with Shockwave on his turn is super important because it gets him thinking, do I have to swing with this blocker, or am I going to lose it to Shockwave? Like, what are the avenues that I have to go down to prevent this? A lot of Whitebeard players are now running Fossa, which is a 2-cost blocker that you can pop with Shockwave. So the game is kind of a lot different for black players now because you couldn't previously pop the 4-cost Marco with Shockwave since it only pops 3 costs. So in my opinion, if you can help it, use Shockwave as more of a removal card, especially when they just mindlessly play a blocker out. And then also very specific, but play Isho after thinning out their hand. I know it's tempting to just want to like let the Isho rip, but you don't really want to do that for 2 reasons. One, you should always be swinging before you play characters, so it makes your turn ambiguous. And then also, you want to be playing Isho after they've thinned out their hand a little bit, because they're going to be countering with cards they don't want in their hand, right? Or that they could live without being in their hand. You don't want to hit those cards when you Isho. You want to hit the cards that they absolutely need in their hand, like their counter events, their 9-cost Whitebeard, their power plays. So be careful, like if they're sitting at 7 cards in hand, maybe that's when you want to Isho so that they can't counter out 2 cards to go down to 5, so your Isho is useless. But if they have like a 10 card, 11 card hand, thin that out before you play the Isho. All right, so moving on to yellow. Again, I said this earlier, but please do not trigger Brule if they can play Marco. If there's a possibility for them to play Marco, you really do not want to be triggering Brule, even though it is a free trigger. Only do it if they don't have enough Dawn to play the Marco and you want to like save yourself from another swing. But if they have 5 Dawn up for that Marco and they're in no danger of dying, like I would just keep that Brule in hand, to be honest. Always 100% go for board when you can, especially if you're playing Katakuri. Also, if you're swinging at their board all the time, you could play the 7-drop to trash a life out of their life instead of them taking it, which is huge. A lot of Whitebeard players, especially like when the set was beginning, like they would just take every life that yellow swung at them because they knew that it could get trashed by the 7 cost or the 10 cost, and then they would just rely on counters and blockers to end the game. But again, if you're playing Katakuri, you still kind of have to play a long game, even though that he's going to be swinging at your face so much. But that's just something you have to deal with. It is something that's difficult with the matchup that it brings. And then on to the next point, do not be afraid to use Thunderbolt from your hand. I've lost, I think, around like 2 or 3 games because I did not use Thunderbolt from my hand on something like an Atmos on board. And it's kind of scary to think about, right? Because you don't want to trash a potential trigger in your life. And then also, if you trash a card out of your life, that's a card that you're not getting out of your hand and you dealt 1 damage to yourself. But what ends up happening, and what ended up happening in this game that I'm talking about, is my opponent had an Atmos on board that was there since turn 2, and it swung at me 3 or 4 times. It took life, it took cards out of my hand, and it would have taken a lot less cards out of my hand if I just played that Thunderbolt, and I might have even won the game if I had that life. So don't be afraid to use that Thunderbolt from your hand, especially if it's early on in the game, and it'll save you a lot of swings. And then my last point is, if they have a blocker out, you might want to save your last life for a potential Thunderbolt on a blocker. I say this because I was on the receiving end on the yellow side playing against Whitebeard, and the only reason why I won that game was because I had Thunderbolt with 1 life standing. I could have just took it because I was going to be going for game next turn anyway, but I ended up countering like 3 or 4 cards in hand over my life because he had a Fossa on board that I just needed to get out of the way so I could start swinging with my 10-drop, my 8-drop Katakuri. So yeah, the Thunderbolt is actually very important in this matchup. Don't be afraid to use it on a big body, and definitely, if you can, save that last life. Do not forget that you have it and save it to use Thunderbolt on something like a blocker. All right, so moving on to purple, the first thing is, it's pretty much like Borsalino, like getting queen down early helps stave off aggression a lot, and it's going to get you more cards in hand, so I would prioritize it, sometimes even overplaying Magellan. Another thing I really want you guys to be wary of is be careful when you're using Hell's Judgment. Again, I know it's very scary for Whitebeard to have like a lot of swings onto you, but a lot of the time Hell's Judgment is really, really good in the late game because that's when those swings actually matter. Sometimes when you use Hell's Judgment, yeah, sure, you're saving a swing because, like, let's say he swings like 8 or 9 at you, you use Hell's Judgment plus like a 1k or a 2k, and then you Hell's Judgment something on board. That doesn't actually solve a lot of your problems because then he could just not swing with like something like that Atmos or just whatever you gave minus 3000 to. So yeah, you're saving like 1 swing, but it doesn't really matter because that card is still on the board and he's not going to rest it anymore to attack with it. Versus in the late game, if you give 2 things minus 3000, that's minus 6000 in total total that they have to reallocate for their Dawn, and you know, God forbid you have 2, that's 12,000 power that they have to account for extra when they're going for game. And then of course, you know, save tiny blockers, Domino, Black Maria for the end game. Again, for that 9-cost Whitebeard swing, you want them to be swinging with that first and not last. And then this is something I learned in OP2, but getting out the 9-cost Kaido is sometimes just way more important than getting out the 10-cost. And this is because 9-cost Kaido costs less Dawn to use, and it actually removes a lot of things from board. Of course, there are going to be situations where you could just wipe their entire board with 10-cost Kaido. I'm not saying that 9-cost Kaido is better in those cases, but a lot of the time you have like 1 or 2 things on board that you might not want a 10-cost Kaido, because if the Whitebeard player could just rebuild their board in the next 2 turns, you're going to end up dying anyway. So yeah, sometimes the 9-cost Kaido is absolutely insane because, you know, it's a 10k attacker with Rush. It can pop most of the things in Whitebeard's deck, like Atmos and Kingdu, and even Thatch when you need to. The only thing it really doesn't KO is the 7-cost and the 10-cost. Alright, so that is going to be the end of this video today, guys. Thank you all for watching. Again, I'm going to be uploading a lot more once I get my PC in. Hopefully that goes in soon. Also, I'm cooking up something really nice for when we hit 2,000 subscribers, so look forward to that. We hit 1,900 while I was gone, but when we hit that 2,000, we're going to do something very special for you guys that I think you're going to like. So stay tuned for all of that. Next video, I think I'm going to do some like fundamental stuff, like how to be more mindful when we play and the methodology I kind of follow when I'm playing the game. So look forward to that in the future. As always, thank you all for watching. Good luck in anything you're doing, whether that be work, school, anything at all, and I'll see you on the next one.